Hello again, Year 11. In this video, we're going to look at predator-prey relationships and competition relationships and how that can help us predict the consequences for populations of organisms within an ecosystem. We're going to start with predator-prey relationships, and I've got a picture here of a bear and a salmon. Now, the salmon will, during the breeding season, want to migrate into the cooler waters that are where they have their spawning area. And the bear has learnt this, the grizzly bear has learnt this, so they will often hunt for salmon as the salmon are jumping the stream, trying to swim against the stream, against the current. And the bear will sit there perched on the waterfall and just collect the salmon as they go by. Now, this is a very classic predator-prey relationship where we have the bear, that's the predator, and the salmon, that's the prey. And in a relatively closed system like this particular river system or this stream system, we can then predict the likely outcome for the population of bear and the population of a salmon based on this relationship between the predator and the prey, between the bear and the salmon. Now, this is a picture from your textbook, but this shows that very classic kind of predator-prey relationship that we're talking about. Now, if we think of the orange line here as being the prey, being the salmon, and the blue line here being the bear, what we see is a pretty close relationship between how these curves peak and how these curves trough over time. And what we notice is the peak in the population of prey is a little bit before the peak in the population of the predator. And then the trough in the prey is a little bit before the trough in the predator, and so on and so forth. What this tells us is that when times are good and the prey is able to build up its population, then the predator is also able to build up its population because there's more food to go around. It's able to support more total number of bears, in this case, within that ecosystem. But what happens when there becomes too many bears in that ecosystem? They start to eat too many salmon, and so the salmon population will start to drop away. Now, as the salmon population drops away, there's less food for the bear, and so the bear population will start to drop away as well, until eventually it reaches a point where the bear population is so low that the salmon are able to repopulate a bit more, and so their population will go up. And again, as their population goes up, the population of the bear will go up as well. And this will continue on and on in perpetuity, provided there's no drastic changes to that ecosystem. Now, this graph is looking at the number of population compared to or over a certain amount of time. And the time here can be quite long. It can be years or decades. It's unlikely to be days, weeks, or months that you'd see this sort of relationship. We're talking about generations of predators and generations of prey to get this type of graph. Now, to sort of sum it all up, the consequences of predation is fairly predictable, as in we know what happens when there's lots of predators versus not enough prey. So predators affect the population and the distribution of their prey. If they're eating the salmon, there's going to be less salmon. If the salmon are able to change their behaviour and move to different areas, then that's going to affect the distribution of the salmon as well. Now, when there's lots of prey, there's going to be lots of predators. Lots of food, lots of predators that can be supported within that ecosystem. But when the predators start to eat the prey population will decline overall. And then when there's less food, there's going to be less predators because it can't support as many predators in that ecosystem. Now, that predator-prey relationship, that typical pattern that we were talking about, is fairly predictable, but there are certain factors that might impact on that particular relationship that are outside the pure predator-prey relationship that we're talking about. So, for example, a number of predators competing for the same prey. If we've got bears and we've got bigger fish, say, and we've got maybe humans hunting for salmon, these are all different predators that are competing for the same prey. So now we don't have just bears, we've got 2, 3, 4, 5 different predators competing for that same pool of salmon. So that can obviously have a drastic impact on the amount of salmon that are available for all of those organisms. There's also the availability of the prey's food. If it's a particularly harsh season and there's not a lot of food around for the salmon, then that's going to affect their numbers regardless of what the predators are doing. Reproduction rate of both the predator and the prey can impact on that graph as well. If one organism is slower to reproduce, then you might see the population of the prey, for example, really shoot up because the predator is not able to reproduce and repopulate in the numbers as quickly as their prey. There's also the death rate due to other things, diseases, exposure, those sorts of things that are going to impact the number of organisms in that ecosystem. And likewise, the ratio of males to females will also have an impact. If there's lots more males than females, we might see a drop-off in the number of offspring that are produced, or we might see, conversely, an increase in the number of offspring produced if it's a perfect situation for them. The size of the ecosystem can also impact on it as well. If we're thinking of a river system in, say, Alaska, where there might not be a lot of choice for the salmon in terms of where they go to spawn, versus, say, a really open area where there might be lots of different choices for the salmon to make, where they can maybe try and avoid the bears somewhat. So that the size of the ecosystem is going to impact that predator-prey relationship as well. And then the final thing to consider is just the availability of shelter, particularly when it's harsh or extreme weather conditions. Being able to get some protection might help you survive where it might not allow your predators to survive, therefore giving you an advantage in that situation. Now, another relationship to be aware of is a competition relationship. And the difference between a competition and a predator-prey relationship normally is that you're going to see a very clear difference where one organism starts to really increase its population numbers and the other organism will start to really reduce its population numbers. Again, this is a picture from your textbook, but it's showing the competition between two grain beetle species. So over here we would have a situation where there's probably plenty of grain around, and so both beetles are able to increase their population fairly rapidly over a period of maybe 10 to 20 weeks. And then what will happen at some point here, the competition will be on for those resources. And one beetle, in this case the calandra, is able to outcompete the rhizopertha in terms of being able to acquire and eat those resources, eat those grains. Now, it might be an adaptation of speed, ability to fight off their competition. It might just be their size. There could be lots of different adaptations the calandra has that gives us an advantage. But this is part of that idea of the survival of the fittest, where we have a situation here where there's one beetle that has some adaptation that lets it outcompete, and the other beetle doesn't have that same adaptation, so its population starts to dwindle. Now, there will be some fluctuation in the calandra because the amount of food available will fluctuate as well. But what you can see pretty clearly is the population here is far above the population down here. And it's consistent then over time as well, which is a really clear indication that this species here has just outcompeted this species for that available resources, those available grains. Now, there's consequences of competition, just like there's consequences of the predator-prey relationship as well. So population fluctuations can be directly linked to the competing of the species for their resources. So this is the two beetles competing for the grain, and what we see is there's not enough grain for both species to survive, and so only one is able to claim that niche and outcompete the other and be the fittest for that environment in order to continue their population to grow. Now, food source availability is the example used in that graph just before, but when there's lots and lots of food, then there's enough food to support both species. So we saw that early on in that graph on the previous slide. But when there's less food, then that's going to impact the abundance of both species, where usually one species will outcompete the other, even though it might reduce the number overall of both species. The difference between that, though, and the predator-prey relationship is we don't see that bouncing back of the species that's losing the competition battle. And so this all leads to the idea of this consequence of symbiosis, or how these organisms live and relate together. So symbiosis can increase biodiversity. It can help develop new species by the integration of the genetic material that allows them to survive better or be the fittest version in that environment as well. And increased biodiversity can lead to more resilient ecosystems. The more biodiverse a situation is, the more biodiverse the organisms within that ecosystem are, the more likely it is that ecosystem will survive drastic changes. And certainly smaller changes will be able to survive those without too much effect. Now, if we think of coral reefs are only possible due to the symbiotic relationship between coral and algae. And those coral reefs then are able to provide habitats for different species of fish. And so as long as those reefs are healthy, then those fish can live in that area and populate that area, and we end up having a fairly resilient ecosystem. But something we're seeing in our coral reefs, particularly in the barrier reef, is as we see climate change take effect and the water temperature increase and acidity of the ocean increase as well due to the carbon dioxide that's been absorbed in the water, we see a situation where those algae and coral relationships aren't able to be maintained anymore. And we get something we call coral bleaching, where the coral will spew out the algae to protect itself rather than trying to share its resources to also protect and provide food for the algae.